In a quiet little neighborhood, where the houses all looked like they belonged in a postcard, lived a young couple who had finally found their dream home. The house wasn't huge or fancy, but it was perfect for them. A cozy 2-story place, with a white picket fence and a small garden out front. For the first time in their lives, everything seemed to be falling into place. They were happy, hopeful, and excited about the future. But life has a funny way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. The man of the house worked hard every day, clocking long hours at his job. Recently, he'd even gotten a promotion, which meant more money to support his growing family. His wife stayed home most days, taking care of things around the house and preparing for the arrival of their first child. She spent her afternoons tending to the flower beds in the yard, planting bright marigolds and fragrant lavender that made the whole place feel warm and inviting. It was during one of these peaceful gardening sessions that Trouble decided to pay them a visit. On this particular afternoon, the sun was shining and there was a gentle breeze rustling through the trees. Everything felt calm, almost too calm. As she knelt by the flower bed, carefully trimming away dead leaves, she heard footsteps crunching on the gravel path leading up to the house. Looking up, she saw 2 men walking toward her. They wore uniforms that looked vaguely official, complete with badges pinned to their chests. At first glance, they could have passed for security guards or maybe even police officers, but something about them didn't sit right. "Excuse me, ma'am," one of the men said, his voice firm but not exactly friendly. "We're here on behalf of the Homeowners Association. We need to talk to you about your landscaping." She blinked, confused. Landscaping? What could possibly be wrong with her flowers? Her husband had already warned her about the HOA, the group of people who oversaw the neighborhood's rules, but she hadn't paid much attention. After all, how strict could they really be? Rules about keeping the grass cut short or painting the mailbox a certain color, sure. But flowers? That seemed ridiculous. "I'm sorry," she replied, standing up and brushing dirt off her hands. "What's the problem?" One of the men gestured toward the colorful blooms spread across the front yard. "Your flowers are asymmetrical," he said flatly, as if stating the obvious. According to HOA guidelines, all landscaping must maintain symmetry. "You'll need to remove the ones on the left side immediately." She stared at him, dumbfounded. Asymmetrical? Was he serious? This couldn't be real. "I don't think I can do that," she said cautiously, trying to keep her tone polite despite the absurdity of the request. "These flowers are important to me. My husband and I planted them together." The second man stepped forward, crossing his arms over his chest. His expression hardened. "Ma'am, we're not asking," he snapped. "This is a violation of community standards. If you refuse to comply, there will be consequences." Consequences for flowers? The absurdity of the situation hit her like a punch to the gut. She shook her head firmly. "No, I'm not doing it. These flowers stay." That's when things took a turn. One of the men reached out suddenly, grabbing her wrist with surprising force. She gasped, pain shooting up her arm. Instinctively, she tried to pull away, but his grip only tightened. "Let go," she cried, panic rising in her chest. But instead of releasing her, he twisted her arm further, making her cry out louder. By sheer luck, her husband arrived home just moments later. He pulled into the driveway, completely unaware of what was happening, until he saw his wife struggling against the man holding her. Rage bubbled inside him as he jumped out of the car and rushed over. "Get your hands off her," he shouted, his voice booming with authority. Startled, the man let go, stepping back as if caught red-handed. The other uniformed figure muttered something under his breath, then both of them turned and walked briskly back to their vehicle without another word. They drove off, leaving behind a cloud of dust and unanswered questions. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Her husband wrapped an arm around her shoulders, guiding her inside the house. Once they were safe indoors, he examined her wrist, wincing at the sight of the red marks forming. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, though his jaw was clenched, tight with anger. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'm fine," she whispered. "But What just happened? Who were those guys? Her husband didn't have an answer. All he knew was that someone needed to hold the HOA accountable for whatever nonsense they were pulling. Enough was enough. Little did they know, this incident was only the beginning of a much bigger storm brewing on the horizon. The days following the incident were a blur of frustration and unanswered questions. The man couldn't shake the image of his wife being grabbed like that. Her face pale with fear, her voice trembling as she cried out in pain. It wasn't just about the flowers anymore. It was about respect, safety, and standing up for what was right. He decided to take action, starting with filing a formal complaint against the HOA. But as he typed out an email detailing everything that had happened, he couldn't help but feel uneasy. Something about those men didn't add up. They hadn't acted like officials. Their uniforms looked too generic, their badges seemed hastily made, and their behavior was far from professional. Still, he hit send on the email, hoping someone would listen. Days passed without a response. No apology, no explanation, not even an acknowledgement that his complaint had been received. Instead, strange things began happening around their property. At first, it was subtle, a car parked across the street late at night, its engine idling for hours before driving away. Then came anonymous notes taped to their front door written in blocky letters, "Comply or face consequences." It started to feel like they were being watched. Every time he stepped outside, he got the eerie sensation that eyes were on him. His wife noticed it too. She'd glance out the window while washing dishes and see shadowy figures lingering near the edge of their yard. Neither of them felt safe anymore. What was supposed to be their dream home now felt like a prison. Determined to get answers, he decided to install security cameras around the house. If someone was trying to intimidate them, he wanted proof. He spent an entire weekend setting up cameras at every angle, above the garage, beside the front door, even hidden among the bushes in the backyard. By the end of it, he felt a little better knowing they'd have evidence if anything else happened. That night, unable to sleep, he sat in the living room reviewing footage from the previous evening. The screen flickered as he fast-forwarded through hours of nothingness, just empty streets and swaying trees. But then, something caught his eye. Around midnight, a black SUV rolled slowly down their street, its headlights dimmed. It stopped, directly in front of their house, and two men stepped out. Even in the grainy video, he recognized them immediately. They were the same men who had confronted his wife in the garden, the ones claiming to be HOA enforcement officers. His blood ran cold as he watched them walk up and down the driveway, peering into windows and snapping photos of the house. One of them jotted something down on a clipboard, while the other pointed toward the flower bed. After a few minutes, they climbed back into the SUV and drove off. The whole thing lasted less than 5 minutes, but it confirmed his worst fears. They weren't just dealing with overzealous neighbors or bureaucratic red tape. These men were targeting them specifically. The next morning, he dug deeper. He pulled up the HOA's website and scrolled through the list of board members and staff. There were pictures of smiling faces alongside titles like President and Treasurer, but none of them matched the men from the footage. He expanded his search online, typing keywords like fake HOA officers and neighborhood harassment. To his shock, he stumbled across forum posts from other residents in nearby neighborhoods describing eerily similar experiences. People talked about aggressive enforcers showing up unannounced, making unreasonable demands and sometimes resorting to threats or violence when challenged. One post stood out. A user claimed that some HOAs hired private contractors to handle disputes, men with no real authority who often crossed ethical lines to get results. Attached to the post was a blurry photo of two individuals dressed in uniforms nearly identical to the ones he'd seen. Someone in the comments identified them as known troublemakers with records of impersonating law enforcement. His stomach churned as he realized the truth. These so-called enforcers weren't legit. They were hired thugs masquerading as authority figures, using intimidation tactics to bully homeowners into compliance. Fury boiled inside him, but beneath the anger was a deep sense of responsibility. His wife was pregnant, vulnerable, and counting. on him to keep her safe. He couldn't let anyone hurt her, or their unborn child. That afternoon, he retrieved his Glock 19 from the locked safe where it had sat untouched for years. He checked the magazine, loaded it carefully, and placed it back in the safe, vowing only to use it as a last resort. He didn't want trouble, but if push came to shove, he wouldn't hesitate to protect his family. Over dinner that night, he tried to reassure his wife. "We're going to be okay," he said, though his tone betrayed his unease. "I've got cameras set up and I've done my research. Those guys aren't real cops, they're fakes, and we'll figure this out together." She nodded, forcing a smile despite the worry etched on her face. "I trust you," she whispered. "But I'm scared." He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I know. Me too. But we're stronger than this. We'll get through it." As they cleared the dishes and prepared for bed, neither of them could shake the feeling that something big was coming. The neighborhood, once a symbol of peace and stability, now felt like a powder keg waiting to explode. And somewhere out there, those men were planning their next move. Whatever happened. Next, one thing was certain: he wouldn't back down. Not when his family's safety was on the line. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, the kind where the air smells faintly of fallen leaves and the sunlight filters through the trees in golden streaks. The man was outside, washing his car in the driveway. It had been days since he'd last seen any sign of the fake HOA enforcers, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they'd moved on. His wife was inside, resting on the couch as she often did these days. She'd been quieter than usual, her hand instinctively cradling her swollen belly whenever she thought no one was looking. The stress of everything was taking its toll, but she tried to stay strong. For him, for their baby, for both of them. As he scrubbed at a stubborn spot of dirt on the hood of the car, the sound of screeching tires shattered the calm. He turned, just in time to see a black SUV skid to a halt in front of their house. 4 men spilled out, all wearing the same generic uniforms he'd come to dread. 2 of them he recognized immediately, the ones who had grabbed his wife weeks earlier. But there were 2 others with them now, faces cold and unreadable. Each carried something in their hands: batons, pepper spray, and what looked like zip ties. For a split second, the world seemed to freeze. His heart pounded in his chest and his mind raced. Were they here to intimidate, to threaten, or worse? One of the men stepped forward, pointing a finger directly at him. "You've got a problem following rules," the man barked, his voice cutting through the quiet like a knife. "We're here to make sure you understand how this neighborhood works." The man set down the sponge, his hands trembling slightly but his expression steady. "I don't know who you think you are," he said, his voice low but firm. "But you're not welcome here. Leave my property now." Instead of backing off, the men exchanged smirks almost as if they were enjoying themselves. Another one spoke up, louder this time. "Oh, we're not leaving until you comply. And if you won't, we'll take matters into our own hands." Before he could respond, the front door creaked open behind him. His wife appeared, her face pale but determined. "Please," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "Just go. You've done enough." Her appearance only seemed to embolden the intruders. One of them lunged forward, brushing past the husband and grabbing her by the arm, the same arm that had been injured before. She cried out in pain, tears springing to her eyes as the man twisted her wrist cruelly. "This is your last warning," he snarled, his breath hot against her face. "Fix your yard, or next time it'll be worse." That's when something inside the man snapped. He didn't think, he acted. Reaching behind him, he pulled the Glock 19 from the holster tucked into the back of his jeans. The movement was quick, deliberate, and unmistakable. When he raised the weapon, pointing it squarely at the group, the smirk vanished from their faces. For the first time, they looked uncertain, even afraid. "Let her go," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. Now. Time seemed to slow as everyone froze. The man gripping his wife hesitated for half a second too long, his grip tightening reflexively. Without thinking twice, the husband fired a single shot into the air. The crack of the gunshot echoed through the neighborhood, startling birds from nearby trees and sending a chill down his spine. The effect was immediate. The men stumbled, backward, releasing his wife and raising their hands defensively. But the reprieve was short-lived. One of the newcomers, clearly more brazen than the rest, reached for the baton strapped to his belt. The husband saw the motion out of the corner of his eye and reacted instantly. Years of training kicked in, overriding fear and hesitation. Aimed carefully, squeezing the trigger again and again. Each shot found its mark, not to kill, but to disable. Legs buckled, arms flailed, and within seconds, all 4 men collapsed onto the ground, groaning in pain. Smoke curled from the barrel of the gun as he stood over them, chest heaving, adrenaline coursing through his veins. His ears rang from the noise and his hands shook uncontrollably, but he forced himself to stay focused. He ejected the magazine, checked the chamber, and placed the weapon on the hood of the car, ensuring it was secure and out of reach. Only then did he turn to check on his wife. She was sitting on the porch steps, clutching her arm but otherwise unharmed. Her wide eyes locked onto his, filled with a mixture of shock, relief, and gratitude. "Are you okay?" he asked, kneeling beside her. His voice cracked under the weight of everything that had just happened. She nodded, swallowing hard. "I'm fine," she whispered. "Thank you. Thank you for protecting us." Neighbors began pouring out of their houses, drawn by the commotion. Some stood frozen in disbelief, while others hurried to call 911. Within minutes, the wail of sirens filled the air as police cars and ambulances sped toward the scene. Officers arrived quickly, assessing the situation with practiced efficiency. They separated the couple from the wounded men, asking questions and gathering statements. When the responding officers reviewed the security footage and heard the full HOA story, their expressions shifted from skepticism to understanding. One of them nodded grimly. "These guys aren't legit," he said, gesturing to the men being loaded onto stretchers. "They've got records, a bunch of scams and impersonation charges. We've been trying to track them down for months." Relief washed over the husband, though it was tinged with guilt. He hadn't wanted things to escalate this far, but he knew deep down that he'd had no choice. As the chaos unfolded around him, he kept glancing at his wife, making sure she was safe. She sat quietly, holding his hand tightly, her presence grounding him in a way nothing else could. By the time the authorities finished processing the scene, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the driveway. The streetlights flickered on, illuminating the remnants of the confrontation. Neighbors lingered on their porches, whispering amongst themselves, unsure whether to feel grateful or terrified. For the first time in weeks, the man felt a flicker of peace, not because of what he'd done, but because he'd finally drawn a line in the sand. No one would ever hurt his family again, not while he still had breath in his body. Still, he couldn't shake the heaviness in his chest. Protecting his loved ones had come at a cost, and he wasn't sure yet if he was ready to face the consequences. The aftermath of the shooting stretched out like a long, heavy shadow over the neighborhood. The streetlights hummed softly in the cool night air as police officers worked methodically, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Neighbors huddled together on porches or peered out from behind curtains, whispering and pointing at the scene unfolding in the driveway. It was the kind of thing you'd expect to see on TV, not in your own backyard. The man stood near his car, still, trying to process everything that had just happened. His hands were shaking so badly he had to clench them into fists just to steady himself. He could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him, curious, judgmental, maybe even scared. But none of that mattered right now. All he cared about was his wife, who sat on the porch steps with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She looked small and fragile, but when she caught his gaze, she gave him a weak smile. That tiny gesture meant more to him than anything else at that moment. Police officers approached him cautiously, asking questions in calm, measured tones. They wanted to know what had led up to the confrontation, why he'd fired his weapon, and whether he felt threatened enough to justify using lethal force. He answered honestly, explaining how those men had harassed them for weeks, how they'd hurt his wife, and how they refused to leave even after being told to do so. He showed them the security footage he'd recorded, the late-night visits, the aggressive behavior, the blatant disregard for boundaries. As the officers reviewed the evidence, their expressions shifted from skepticism to understanding. One of them nodded slowly, glancing at the wounded men being loaded onto stretchers by paramedics. "These guys aren't legit," he said, his voice low but firm. "We've seen reports about them impersonating officials and harassing homeowners in other neighborhoods too. You did the right thing defending your family." Hearing those words brought some relief, but it didn't erase the storm brewing inside him. He kept replaying the moments in his head, the sound of the gunshots, the way the men fell, the look of sheer terror on their faces. He hadn't aimed to kill. He'd only wanted to stop them before they could hurt anyone else. Still, knowing that he'd pulled the trigger multiple times left him feeling uneasy. Was he a protector or something worse? Would others see him as a hero or a monster? His wife seemed to sense his inner turmoil because she reached out and squeezed his hand tightly. "You saved us," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant hum of sirens. "Don't forget that." Her words helped ground him, reminding him of why he'd done what he'd done. This wasn't about revenge or anger. It was about keeping his family safe. No matter what people might say later, he knew deep down that he'd made the right choice. But that didn't mean there wouldn't be consequences. By the time the authorities finished processing the scene, the sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The neighborhood, usually quiet and sleepy at this hour, buzzed with activity. Reporters had arrived, setting up cameras and microphones outside the yellow tape cordoning off the area. Word spread quickly, turning the incident into local news fodder. Some neighbors praised him for standing up to bullies, while others muttered about how dangerous it all was. A few even suggested that he should have called the police instead of taking matters into his own hands. When reporters tried to approach him for an interview, he politely declined, keeping his focus on his wife. She needed him now more than ever, and he wasn't about to let media attention add to her stress. Instead, he guided her back inside the house, closing the door firmly behind them. For a few minutes, they simply sat together in silence, holding each other tightly as the adrenaline began to wear off. Over the next few days, the story dominated headlines. Local news stations aired segments dissecting every detail, while online, forums lit up with debates about self-defense, vigilante justice, and the role of HOAs in communities. Some praised him as a brave homeowner who stood up to corruption, while others criticized him for resorting to violence. Through it all, he stayed off social media, refusing to engage with the noise. What mattered most was protecting his family, not arguing with strangers on the internet. Meanwhile, the HOA scrambled to distance itself from the incident. In a hastily issued statement, they denied any involvement with the fake enforcers, claiming they had no idea who those men were or why. They were targeting residents, but leaked documents told a different story. Emails and memos revealed that certain board members had contracted private enforcement teams to handle disputes without proper oversight. Public outrage erupted, leading to multiple resignations and calls for reform within the organization. Despite the chaos swirling around them, the couple found solace in their shared strength. They attended therapy sessions together, working through the trauma of the incident and preparing for the arrival of their baby. Talking about it helped, but healing would take time. Every loud noise made her jump, and every stranger walking past the house set him on edge. They both knew it would be a while before they felt truly safe again. One evening, as they sat on the couch flipping through channels, a reporter mentioned their case during a segment about neighborhood safety. The anchor posed a question to viewers. Where do we draw the line between protecting ourselves and escalating conflict? It was a good question, one that lingered in the air long after the TV was turned off. He glanced at his wife, who was curled up beside him, her hand resting protectively on her belly. "I don't regret what I did," he said finally, breaking the silence. "But I hope I never have to do it again." She nodded, leaning her head against his shoulder, Me too, she murmured. Let's just focus on our baby now. On building a better future. And that's exactly what they did. As the weeks passed, life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. The flowers in the garden continued to bloom, defying the HOA's ridiculous rules. Their home, once a source of fear, became a sanctuary again, a place filled with love, laughter, and hope. Still, the memory of that day lingered in the corners of their minds, a reminder of how far they'd come and how much they'd fought to protect what mattered most. They weren't the same people they'd been before the incident. They were stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to live their lives on their own terms. Months had passed since that fateful day in the driveway, but the memory of it still lingered like a faint scar, visible only if you looked closely, yet impossible to ignore completely. Life had moved forward, as it always does, but the couple found themselves changed in ways they hadn't anticipated. The man often caught himself glancing out the window at odd hours, checking for shadows or unfamiliar cars parked across the street. His wife, too, had developed new habits, double locking doors, jumping at sudden noises, and sometimes waking up in the middle of the night with her heart racing. They were healing, yes, but the process was slow and uneven, like stitching together a torn piece of fabric. The neighborhood itself had transformed in subtle ways. Gone were the days when people whispered about HOA rules behind closed doors. Now everyone talked openly about accountability and transparency. The fallout from the incident had exposed cracks within the organization, forcing residents to demand change. New board members were elected, ones who prioritized fairness over control. Stricter regulations were put in place to prevent private contractors from impersonating officials, and regular audits ensured compliance. For the first time in years, the community felt like it belonged to its residents again, not just to a handful of power-hungry bureaucrats. But while the neighborhood healed, the couple's personal journey was far more complex. Therapy sessions became a lifeline for them, helping them unpack the trauma and rebuild their sense of security. At first, it was hard to open up, especially when memories of that day came flooding back. He would describe the weight of the gun in his hand, the deafening sound of the shots, the way time seemed to stretch endlessly as he pulled the trigger. She would talk about the fear she felt when those men grabbed her arm, the helplessness of being unable to protect herself, or their unborn child. Their therapist, a kind woman with a soothing voice, encouraged them to focus on the positives. "You survived something incredibly difficult," she reminded them during one session, "and you did it together. That says a lot about your strength as individuals and as a team." Her words resonated deeply, giving them permission to forgive themselves for the choices they'd made under extreme pressure. Slowly but surely, they began to let go of some of the guilt and anxiety that had weighed them down. As winter gave way to spring, signs of renewal appeared everywhere. The flowers in their garden bloomed brighter than ever, defying not only the HOA's old rules but also the darkness that had once clouded their lives. One sunny morning, as he watered the plants, his wife joined him outside, holding a tiny bundle, wrapped in soft blankets. Their baby girl had arrived just weeks earlier, bringing with her a fresh wave of joy and purpose. She cooed softly as her mother rocked her gently, her little fingers curling around strands of sunlight. Looking at them, he felt a lump rise in his throat. All the pain, fear, and uncertainty suddenly seemed worth it, because it had led them here. To this moment, this family. He knelt beside them, brushing a finger against the baby's cheek. "She's perfect," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. His wife smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "We made it," she said softly. "Through everything, we made it." In the months that followed, they threw themselves into parenting with a determination born of resilience. Sleepless nights and endless diaper changes tested their patience, but they faced each challenge side by side, drawing strength from their shared experiences. They laughed more, held hands often, and made a conscious effort to cherish the small moments. A shared cup of coffee in the morning, a quiet walk after dinner, the sound of their daughter giggling as she reached for a toy. They also took steps to ensure their home remained a safe haven. Security cameras stayed in place, though they rarely needed them anymore. The fake enforcers had disappeared entirely, either arrested for their crimes or too afraid to show their faces again. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now waved hello and stopped by to chat. Some even brought gifts for the baby, a handmade quilt, a stuffed animal, a potted plant for the garden. It was as if the entire neighborhood had been given a second chance to start over, to build connections based on trust rather than fear. Still, there were moments when the past crept back in. Late at night, lying awake in bed, he would wonder what might have happened if he hadn't acted when he did. What if those men had hurt his wife? Or worse, would anyone have believed their story? Would justice have been served? These thoughts haunted him, but they also reinforced his belief in standing up for what was right no matter the cost. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, he broached the subject with his wife. "Do you think we'll ever stop thinking about it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She leaned her head against his shoulder, thoughtful for a moment. "Probably not," she admitted. "But maybe we don't have to. Maybe it's okay to carry it with us, as long as it reminds us how strong we are." He nodded, squeezing her hand tightly. Stronger than we ever thought possible. Their baby stirred in her bassinet nearby, letting out a soft whimper before settling back into sleep. They both glanced at her, smiling despite themselves. No matter what challenges lay ahead, they knew they could face them together. After all, they had already weathered the worst storm life could throw at them. As the sky darkened and stars began to twinkle overhead, they sat in comfortable silence, grateful for the peace they had fought so hard to reclaim. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but they were ready for whatever came next. Together, they had built a foundation rooted in love, courage, and unwavering resolve. A foundation strong enough to withstand anything. And so life moved forward. The scars remained, but they no longer defined them. Instead, they served as reminders of where they had been and how far they had come. Their story wasn't just one of survival. It was one of triumph, redemption, and hope. A story they would someday tell their daughter, not to scare her, but to teach her the importance of standing up for what matters most. Because in the end, true strength isn't measured by the battles you fight, but by the love you protect along the way.